There's a moment I've heard described to me hundreds of times across 15 years of clinical work. It doesn't happen in an argument. It doesn't happen at the height of a fight. It happens quietly, maybe at a family dinner or on a phone call, or when you try to say something kind and your child looks at you with that expression, the one that says you're irrelevant, and you feel it. That specific kind of pain that has no clean name, the pain of being resented by someone you gave everything to. And the worst part isn't the resentment itself, the worst part is what you've been doing with it. You've been apologizing, accommodating, shrinking, walking on eggshells around your own child, hoping that if you're careful enough, patient enough, available enough, the resentment will eventually soften. It hasn't. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you already know that what you're doing isn't working. You've known for a while. What I'm going to give you today is not a script for an apology. It's not a list of ways to be more understanding. It's not advice on how to wait this out. I'm going to show you the one rule that, when a parent applies it consistently, forces the dynamic to shift, not because it manipulates the child, because it changes the only thing that was ever in your control. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what your child's resentment is feeding on, why everything you've tried so far has kept that resentment alive, and what you can do differently starting with the next conversation. Stay with me. Every piece of this matters. I want to tell you about David. David was 38 years old when his mother Margaret first came to see me. He had a good job, a partner, a life that looked stable from the outside. But Margaret described something I recognized immediately. Every time she called, David answered with a flatness in his voice that said, "I'm tolerating this." When she shared something about her life, he either redirected the conversation or gave responses so brief they functioned more like a door closing than an answer. On the rare occasions they spent time together, he had a way of referencing the past, her past, that left her feeling like she was perpetually on trial for something she'd never fully been charged with. She came to me with the question that most parents in her situation eventually ask: what did I do to make him like this? I told her we'd get to that. But first, I needed her to answer a different question. "Margaret, what have you been doing with his resentment?" She looked at me, thought for a moment, then said, "I've been trying to show him I understand." That's where we started. Here's what I've seen in 15 years of working with families in this exact situation. When a parent responds to a child's resentment with understanding, with accommodation, with repeated demonstrations of empathy, they believe they are de-escalating. They believe they are building a bridge. What they are actually doing is confirming the resentment's logic. This is the part that's hardest to hear, so I want to say it carefully. A child who resents a parent has built a story. That story has a structure. In the story, the parent did something, maybe many things, that caused harm. And the resentment is the emotional evidence that the story is true. Every time the parent responds to resentment with visible guilt, with over-apology, with bending, with shrinking, the child's nervous system registers that as confirmation. The parent's behavior is saying, "Yes, you're right to feel this way. Yes, I owe you something I haven't finished paying." And resentment, when it gets confirmation, doesn't dissolve. It deepens. Margaret had been doing this for 4 years without realizing it. Every phone call where she stayed gentle past the point of comfort. Every visit where she absorbed the coldness without addressing it. Every moment she swallowed what she really wanted to say because she was afraid of making things worse. Each of those moments had been a deposit into the account of David's grievance. She thought she was being patient. She was actually being fuel. Now, and this is where most explanations stop, which is exactly why the problem doesn't get solved. The answer isn't to stop being empathetic. Empathy isn't the problem. The delivery is the problem. The function the empathy is serving is the problem. When empathy operates as appeasement, it keeps the resentful child in a position of power over the relationship. They hold the grievance, you manage the grievance. That's the dynamic. And that dynamic will not change by adding more of the same. But there's something underneath all of this that Margaret hadn't seen yet, something that made the whole picture harder, and it took 3 sessions before she was ready to look at it. What Margaret hadn't told me, what she'd been carrying quietly the entire time, was that she knew on some level what the resentment was about. She didn't know the details David had constructed in his mind, but she knew there had been years, difficult years, when she hadn't been the mother she wanted to be. A marriage that deteriorated badly. A period where she was so focused on her own survival that David at 14 and 15 and 16 had largely been left to manage on his own. She hadn't abandoned him. She'd been present physically, but she'd been absent in the ways that mattered most to an adolescent trying to understand the world. She knew this. She'd spent years knowing it. And that knowledge had been quietly driving every accommodation, every apology, every moment of swallowing discomfort. There was guilt underneath the appeasement, real guilt rooted in something real. This is where the situation becomes genuinely complicated, because there's a version of this story where David's resentment is, at its origin, a reasonable response to something that actually happened. And there's another version where what was reasonable at 16 has calcified into something else entirely by 38, something that now operates less like an emotion and more like an identity. Both can be true at the same time. A child can have legitimate pain from the past and still, as an adult, be using that pain in ways that damage the relationship in the present. These are not mutually exclusive. The original wound can be real, and the current behaviour can still be unacceptable. Margaret had collapsed these two things together. She believed that because the original pain was real, she had no standing to address the current behaviour. She believed she'd forfeited that right somewhere around David's 15th birthday. That belief was the thing that was actually keeping them stuck. And then she told me something that changed the entire shape of what I was seeing. She told me that 6 months earlier, she had written David a letter, a long letter, careful, honest, specific. She'd named what she understood she'd gotten wrong. She'd described the period that had been hardest. She'd taken responsibility directly, without hedging, without qualifying. It had taken her 3 weeks to write it. David had received it. He'd read it. She knew he'd read it because he'd acknowledged receiving it in a text message. He'd never responded to the letter itself, not in 3 words, not in 30, nothing. When Margaret told me this, I noticed something shift in how she described her relationship with David after that point. The accommodation had increased, the eggshell walking had gotten more careful. The guilt had gotten louder, because she had offered the most complete act of accountability she knew how to offer, and it had been received in silence, and she had interpreted that silence as proof that she still owed more. But here's what I need you to understand about that letter, and about that silence. An apology, a real one, a complete one, changes the moral architecture of a relationship. Before the letter, David's resentment had a clear target, the unacknowledged wrong. After the letter, the wrong had been acknowledged. The apology had been made. What happened after that was David's choice. His response, the silence, was David's behaviour, not a continuation of her debt. Margaret had given him something of real weight, and she'd watched him hold it without responding, and then she'd kept accommodating as if the letter had never been sent. She had apologised sincerely, and then immediately gone back to behaving as if she hadn't. The resentment wasn't surviving on what she'd done years ago. By that point, it was surviving on what she was doing now, on the dynamic she was maintaining, on the fact that she'd handed him accountability and then, in the silence that followed, handed him control of the relationship as well. This is the piece almost no one explains clearly. You can do everything right in terms of taking responsibility and still keep the problem alive by what you do after. The rule I'm going to give you now is not complicated, but applying it is genuinely hard, and I want to be honest about that before I say it. The rule is this: you stop managing their resentment and you start responding to their behaviour. Those are two completely different things, and the difference is everything. Managing resentment looks like this: staying silent when something dismissive is said because you don't want to escalate. Explaining yourself repeatedly to someone who already has your explanation. Monitoring your own words more carefully than the situation requires. Absorbing contempt and calling it patience. Responding to behavior looks like this: when something specific and unacceptable happens, you address that specific thing, calmly, without drama, with a precision that's difficult to misread. I gave Margaret 3 phrases. I want to give them to you the same way I gave them to her, with enough context that you understand what they do, not just what they say. The first phrase is for the moments when the dismissiveness is in the tone, the interruption, the eye roll, the way a sentence gets cut off before it's finished. The response is, "When you speak to me that way, I'd rather we continue this conversation another time." No elaboration. No, because it hurts me. No, you always do this. Just that. Said evenly, and then followed, this is critical, by the action it describes. The conversation stops. Not with a door slam, not with tears, it simply stops. What this does is place the consequence on the behavior, not on your emotional state. It tells them what you just did has a specific outcome. It isn't about whether I'm upset. It's about what happens next. The second phrase is for the moments when your perspective is dismissed, corrected with contempt, or treated as fundamentally less valid than theirs. The response is, "You may be right, I think differently." And then you stop arguing. You don't pursue their agreement. You don't defend the position further. You don't explain why you also have a point. The reason this phrase works is what it refuses to do. It gives them nothing to dismantle. There's no defense to knock down, no argument to win. There's just your perspective stated with a calm that communicates something very specific. You don't need their validation to know what you think. For a child who has spent years watching a parent seek approval or collapse into justification, that is new information. The brain has to process it. The third phrase is for the moments that cross a clear line. Something explicitly contemptuous, something said in front of others, something that would be recognized by any observer as genuinely over the line. The response is, "What you just said is not something I'm going to let go. When you're ready to speak differently, I'll be here." 3 parts, each deliberate. The first part names the behavior without describing the wound. It doesn't say, "That hurt me." It says, "That happened," and it's not passing unmarked. The second part sets a condition, not a punishment. When you're ready to speak differently, not when you apologize, because that starts a negotiation, just a condition about how the conversation continues. The third part keeps the door open without begging. "I'll be here" says, "I'm not going anywhere. But this conversation, in this form, is done." Margaret left that session with the 3 phrases written on her phone. She told me they felt too clinical for her style. I told her they would feel that way until the first time she used one and saw what happened. The first moment came 9 days later. David had called on a Wednesday evening. Routine conversation. She mentioned she'd been thinking of visiting for a weekend. She hadn't seen him in 2 months. He said with that flatness she knew perfectly, "Mum, I've got a lot going on right now. I can't be managing other people's timelines." Managing other people's timelines, meaning her. In the past, Margaret would have said something like, "Of course, I understand, whenever works for you," and she would have ended the call feeling exactly 2 inches tall. This time, she breathed for a second and said, "When you speak to me that way, I'd rather we continue this conversation another time." Silence. Several seconds. David said, "What do you mean, what way?" She didn't answer that question. She said, "When you want to talk about the visit, I'd love to." And she ended the call. She told me her hands were shaking for 20 minutes afterward. She was certain he wouldn't call back for weeks. She went to the kitchen, made tea she didn't drink, and stood at the window thinking she'd made a catastrophic mistake. He called back that evening, not with an apology that wasn't going to come yet, but with a different tone. He asked which weekend she'd been thinking of. That was not a transformation. I want to be very clear about that. One conversation does not undo years of patterned dynamic, but it was the first time the dynamic had received new information. And David's nervous system, whether he was consciously aware of it or not, had to process something it hadn't encountered before from her. The second test came 3 weeks later. A family lunch, David's home, his partner also present. Margaret said something about a decision David was making, nothing dramatic, a genuine observation. David looked at her with that expression and said, "You really don't get how things work, do you?" in front of his partner who heard every word. Margaret felt the familiar pull downward, the old reflex. Make yourself smaller, smooth this over, don't make a scene. She looked at David and said evenly, "You may be right. I think differently." Then she asked his partner about something she'd mentioned the last time they spoke. What happened in the seconds after that was something Margaret hadn't anticipated. David had nothing to work with. There was no argument to continue, no position to demolish, no defensive reaction to feed on, just a calm disagreement that had already moved on. He shifted in his chair. The conversation continued, but with something slightly different in it, an almost imperceptible adjustment in how he was occupying the space. His partner caught Margaret's eye across the table. Nothing was said, but the look said something. The weeks 2 and 3 were the hardest. This is what I tell every parent who begins this process. The behavior almost always intensifies before it adjusts. This is not failure. This is the system testing whether the new information is real or temporary. David called with a sharpness that felt deliberate. He interrupted Margaret 3 times in 4 minutes. When she used the first phrase, "I'd rather we continue this another time," he said something I've heard in versions from dozens of families. "What's gotten into you lately? You're being very sensitive." That's a sophisticated move, whether he knew it or not. It takes the behavior off the table and puts Margaret's reaction on it instead. Suddenly, the problem isn't his contempt. The problem is her fragility. Margaret almost retreated. She told me she felt enormous pressure to say, "You're right, sorry, let's keep going." But she said, "You may be right. I think differently," and waited. David made a sound she described as somewhere between a grunt and an exhale, changed the subject. The call continued, but with a carefulness in his tone that hadn't been there before. Not warmth, not yet, just the absence of the open contempt. That's the first stage. The automatic behavior starts finding resistance where it used to find none. By day 22, Margaret noticed something she'd never seen. David would sometimes pause 1 second, maybe 2, before responding. A kind of recalibration, unconscious, but consistent. The system was processing. The real test came 5 weeks in. Margaret had started going to a life drawing class on Thursday evenings, something she'd always wanted to try. She mentioned it to David on a call, mentioned it lightly, not making a thing of it. He said, "That's a bit late in the day for that sort of thing, isn't it?" Not quite contemptuous enough to require the third phrase, but not kind either. Dismissive in that particular way that says, "Your aspirations are faintly ridiculous." Margaret said, "I'm really enjoying it," and moved on. She told me she felt something different after that call, something she had trouble naming. I asked her to try. She said, "I didn't need him to be pleased about it. That was new." That's the thing these phrases actually do when they're used with consistency. They don't just change the conversation, they change what the parent needs from the conversation. And when a parent stops needing a specific response from the child to feel okay, the entire ground of the relationship shifts. I want to be honest with you about outcomes here, because I think you deserve that honesty. What happened with Margaret and David over the following months was real progress. By month 3, the tone of their calls had changed noticeably. The flatness was still there sometimes, but the open dismissiveness had reduced. By month 4, David asked her something about her, not about logistics, about whether she'd continued the drawing class, what she was working on. It was a small thing. But Margaret told me she noticed it the way you notice the first warm day after a long winter. Not because the winter is over, but because something has moved. By month 5, they had a conversation that lasted 40 minutes, where nothing was managed and nothing had to be smoothed over. They disagreed about something halfway through. Neither of them collapsed. And at the end, David said, "I'll call you Thursday." He did. That's one version of how this goes. Approximately, and these are figures drawn from my clinical experience across many cases, approximately 40 to 45% of the time, something like this happens. The behavior shifts, not perfectly, not completely, but in ways that are real and sustained. In another 30% of cases, the improvement is partial. The contempt reduces, but doesn't disappear. The relationship reaches something more functional, but not warm. One client I worked with described it as, "We've reached a peace. It's not what I wanted, but it's so much better than what we had." That is also a genuine outcome. And in roughly 20 to 25% of cases, the resentful child responds to the change in dynamic by increasing the distance. I have to tell you about Sarah. Sarah was 61. Her son James, 34, responded to the first phrase, "I'd rather continue this conversation another time," by not returning to it. Not once. The calls got shorter, then less frequent. At 6 months, contact was minimal. Sarah came back to me with the question I hear in these situations, "Did I make it worse?" Here's what I told her and what I want you to hear. If a child only maintains contact with a parent when they can express contempt without consequence, what existed before was not a relationship in any real sense. It was a dynamic of power dressed up as one. When that dynamic changes, if what remains is silence, the silence wasn't created by the parent's new behavior, it was revealed by it. The resentment had been held in place by the parent's willingness to absorb it. When she stopped absorbing it, the only thing propping up the contact disappeared. That is hard. It is genuinely hard. But the alternative, continuing to absorb contempt indefinitely to preserve the frequency of contact, is its own quiet damage. I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now. The first objection is, if I do this, my child will say I've gone cold, that I don't care anymore. Here's the direct answer. Someone who has been using contempt without consequence for years will experience any limit as cold because they're measuring warmth against a baseline of no boundaries at all. That's not accurate information about the limit, that's information about how miscalibrated the thermometer has become. The second objection is, what if they just get angrier? Initial anger is nearly universal. It's also a sign that the new information landed. People only react to change when something actually changes. The danger is not the initial anger. The danger is that you, frightened by that anger, retreat and teach them that anger is sufficient to restore the previous system. The third, but they've been through so much. They have real pain from real things. Yes, probably, and I will never tell you to dismiss that, but real historical pain does not confer an ongoing right to contempt. Those two things are separate. A person can have a completely legitimate wound and still be managing that wound in ways that damage the present relationship. Addressing the behavior does not erase the wound, it separates the wound from the weapon. The fourth, and this is the most honest one, what if they're partly right and I am part of the problem? Probably, to some degree, most of us are, but being part of the problem does not mean the current behavior is acceptable. The work of understanding your own role in the dynamic runs alongside the work of setting behavioral limits, not instead of it. There are 4 ways to use these phrases that will make them completely ineffective. The first is saying the phrase and then continuing. Margaret did this in week 1. She said, "I'd rather continue this another time," and then, because the silence was unbearable, she kept talking herself. The phrase only works if you follow through with the action it describes. If you say it and then stay, you're teaching them to ignore it. The second is delivering the phrase with so much stored emotion that the message drowns in the feeling. The tone needs to be steady. The emotion exists, you're allowed to feel it, but the exterior has to be calm. That combination is what generates impact. If it comes out shaking or sharp, they respond to the feeling, not to the information. The third is using the phrases inconsistently. 3 good days, then a difficult weekend where you let things pass, then back to the phrases. This teaches the child that the new system is optional. And intermittent reinforcement, where compliance sometimes works, is among the hardest patterns to extinguish. Inconsistency doesn't just reduce the effect, it can strengthen the old behavior. The fourth is using the phrases from a place of resentment yourself. After years of absorbing someone's contempt, it's natural to feel anger when you finally have a tool. But these phrases are not weapons. They're information. The moment the tone shifts from limit setting to score settling, the child detects it and responds to hostility rather than to a boundary. Those produce very different outcomes. There's one last thing I want to say, and I'm not going to soften it. The love you have for your child does not require you to absorb their contempt indefinitely. Tolerating contempt is not love, it's fear wearing love's coat. Real love, the kind that actually serves the relationship long term, includes the capacity to say, what you're doing right now is not acceptable. And to say it without collapsing, without apologizing for saying it, without immediately managing their reaction to having heard it. When a parent does that, something happens that goes beyond the phrases. Something in the relationship structure shifts. The child is no longer relating to someone who will always absorb more. They're relating to a person with actual weight. And people, even resentful ones, even people carrying real historical pain, respond differently to weight than they do to accommodation. Margaret put it to me simply near the end of our work together. She said, "I thought I needed David to change before I could feel better, but I changed first, and that turned out to be the thing." That's the rule. In one sentence, you stop managing the resentment, you start responding to the behavior with calm, with consistency, with words precise enough that they can't be easily misread. The first time you use these phrases, something in your chest will resist. That resistance is real. It's the voice that says if you hold a line, you'll lose them. But what you actually lose when you don't hold it, your own dignity, your own sense of who you are in this relationship, is already costing you more than you realize. If this landed somewhere real for you, comment the word shift below. It helps me know it reached someone who needed it. And if someone in your life is carrying this kind of weight quietly, share this with them, because sometimes the most important thing is just knowing there's a different way to handle this. I'll see you in the next one.